Welcome to the second day of Marx Now, the symposium at the Goethe-Institut in coordination with the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. My name is Suzanne Schneider. I am the Deputy Director of the Brooklyn Institute as well as one of our core faculty members. I'm also going to be moderating this first panel today on Marx and Political Identity. I am a Deputy Director of the Institute. I'm a historian by training. I focus on the history of the modern Middle East, and I'm very happy to be joined here today with two people who are not inside the insular world of academia, to hopefully have what will be a very fruitful conversation. To my right here, we have Ravi Ahmed, who's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. She's recently elected to the DSA's national leadership. As her bio says, you are a native New Yorker, red diaper baby, and a recovering economist and avid knitter. And over here to my left, we have Kali Akuno, who's the director of Cooperation Jackson, an emerging network of worker cooperatives and supporting institutions. Kali comes with a wealth of experience in labor and political organizing, and I'm just very excited to have both of these individuals here with us today. Just to give you a little bit of a sense as to what the mandate of this discussion is, right? Marx and political identity, what does that actually mean? I think that in many ways, this is one of the most kind of pertinent conversations that we need to be having. And it's kind of, our intention here is from multiple disciplinary positions and from kind of multiple, I guess, positions in the work in the world, we're going to take up the vexed relationship between some modes of Marxist analysis and those that argue for more specified treatment of race and gender. This is kind of an ongoing debate, both not only that happens in academic circles, but certainly has ripples outside of the university as well when it comes to how we should organize ourselves politically, how we should think about political and social problems. And particularly in light of recent debates about the role of identity politics, right, and recurring editorials and features in mainstream publications about the notion that progressives must choose between this like white working class and feminist or anti-racist concerns on the other. So this panel is going to explore how and why these lines of activism have been constructed as being mutually exclusive. What types of power dynamics are operative there, and hopefully we'll be able to offer some alternative frameworks to break out of this kind of binary thinking. So with that, I'm actually going to kick it over to you, Ravi, to begin. And we're all going to, just to give you a sense as the structure here, we're all going to be sharing some, I don't know, reflections. And this is not a traditional conference where we're going to read conference papers at you. Mercifully, that is not our format. So we're all going to share some reflections, have a little bit of kind of crosstalk among the three of us, and then hopefully be able to also open it up fairly soon to your questions and comments, and be able to have a kind of a nice dialogue here in the room as well.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the invite. I'm really pleased that this is not a conference where we read lots of papers. As some of you may be aware, the New York City chapter of DSA, which is closing in on 4,000 members, we had our city convention yesterday. So I'm a little exhausted, still a little high. It was a really great conversation about a lot of the issues that I'm sure will come up in the conference today. So. In starting my thoughts on sort of political identity in Marx, I did actually write up some comments, which I will probably have to refer to. Yeah, I'm writing the line between exhausted and over-caffeinated. So one of the things that I think about with political identity, as Marxists, I think a lot of us are marked by a streak of political romanticism and idealism. This is perhaps a crowd that might be more familiar with the philosophical underpinnings of Marx. And it gets us into a lot of trouble. Actually, I think it's not the most useful thing about us. It's lovely, but how do we reckon with a tradition where our central ritual, the revolution, so often fails, right? And not completely fails, obviously. Revolutions are utopian dreams. And if we're lucky, our great successes become normalized, and our failures become the grounds from which the next dream springs. So just as October 1917 was built on the French Revolution, the current moment here in America is built on, among other things, the failures of both the first and the second Reconstructions. Just ask the Koch brothers and the Mercers, who seem quite intent on returning us to the 19th century, where education and health are entirely private and people should be free to die of preventable diseases and hunger. So political identity for Marxists is caught between this beautiful dream and the messy reality that we work in. So I will just make a quick remark that there is, as Suzanne mentioned, a long and storied history of usually shouting at one another among Marxists about class and race and gender, and I'm really just not so interested in perhaps rehashing any of that. I do, however, want to remark on some of the reading that I've been doing lately. Kali and I were talking about this earlier. The sort of slow and steady release of Marx's personal notebooks has, I think, opened up a really fruitful and interesting vein of research and the development of political theory. So I'm thinking about people like Kevin Anderson and Heather Brown, who have really delved into territory that probably Raya Dunevskaya is one of the early people who started pulling open those notebooks and have exposed the degree to which Marx, and even the later Marx, as they say, was just very, very interested in issues of social reproduction, of the family, of the savagery of enslavement in pre-capitalist societies. And one starts to get a sense as one moves through that work that his thinking about capitalist societies and how the engine of capitalism works was likely coming towards a transformation or towards an extension that we are, obviously never going to know what that might have looked like, but it opens up, I think, a very fruitful strain of research for those who are so inclined. And I think one thing that Kali's work for me has always been a touchstone is the current moment that we're in is a bit of an interregnum. The sort of the energy released by 1917, the anti-colonial movements of the post-war era, even the sort of explosiveness of the 60s and 70s, as that energy has died away, as the left has become fractured into sects, into single-issue campaign organizations, we're at a point where we're hopefully seeing a coming together of leftist forces into some sort of new formation. And a lot of my thinking right now is about what we mean by party, what we mean by, the Leninist party model, I think, it never worked particularly well in America. And I have general concerns or sort of, we can talk about that if you want. But I think one of the things that's important about the concept of the party is the concept of institutions. And one of the things that Marx gives us, that Marxism gives us, is a total analysis of the world in which we live. There are lots of very interesting things happening. There are lots of crises of capitalism that we need to deal with. Dealing with them individually definitely doesn't work. Dealing with them in a Marxist framework is difficult. Rebuilding that analysis for the moment, building those institutions to carry that fight forward is certainly complicated, but not engaging in that struggle is definitely going to be a failure. So I guess I'll close with a couple of remarks. One is to go back to this idea of romanticism. I think, no political form is going to be pure. It's not the nature of political action in any sort of sequence. If you watch too many movies or read, comic books, which is one of the things I do for fun, you start thinking that stories are clear, that historical narratives move forward in a planned way. And that's not how life actually works. And that's not how political parties work. So one of the things that people say about DSA is, oh my God, your online culture is so messy. I'm like, can you imagine what left Twitter would have looked like in 1915? Like, that shit would have been brutal. I mean, if you've read Marxist polemics, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, the shit that used to come out of that woman's mouth. I mean, it was, unhelpful and overly aggressive and so forth. So, let's also remember that political activity is in fact a goddamn mess. And I would hope that after so many centuries of struggling with these concepts of revolution, we're hopefully at a point finally, a point of maturity, where we can let go of institutions and models and revolutions that don't work, rather than holding on to them as though they were sort of religious totems. The other thing that I think has been really fruitful about these tensions in feminism, with the Black national movements here in this country and around the world, is that life is, again, complicated. People's experience of class is complex, and we need to actually face up to that. Trying to strip it away is not actually a recipe for political action. It works in coffee houses and at bars. It doesn't really work when you're organizing a strike or trying to build an institution. We have to actually have the courage to experiment and to fail. We have to have the courage to face up to complicated questions and not have answers, which is something that I think a lot of Marxists are maybe not so comfortable with. Our culture has been one where we are assumed, we think we know we have all the answers. And that's just, again, not how organizing works. It's not how political action actually works. So I guess I will close with a call for courage, intellectual as well as political, to actually face up to these kinds of challenges. Thanks.
Thank you. You have your own. Brought your own.
They well endowed us with equipment. Good morning. Y'all are pretty dead. You need some coffee? Good morning. Good morning. All right. So I want to move towards discussion and debate fairly quickly, especially since we have 2 hours. I think last night we started on a good conversation, but we kind of got cut short just as I think it was starting to get real. So I want us to get more to the realness fairly quickly. So I'm gonna keep my comments fairly brief. As it relates to the overall piece, I think one thing critical to kind of contextualize ourselves in a discussion. So I come from a background that in a tendency that I think loosely could be described as revolutionary nationalism, as it's been practiced and struggled through within the United States. And we know in many tendencies of the quote-unquote historic left in the United States, which for most means the white left, that's a trend and a practice which has always been either misunderstood or framed upon in many respects. Now I bring that up to situate who I am so you understand some elements of my history and where I come from. And the thing that I always try to bring to a larger discussion is that when you look at the things like the people's movements, speaking specifically in the United States, so the Black Liberation Movement, the Puerto Rican Liberation Movement, the Indigenous Movement, Chicano Liberation Movement, Hawaii, etc. These are necessary correctives to both bad theory and bad practice. Within the general field of what kind of poses as the left and the general field specifically what poses as Marxism. Now, some of it starts with some of the limitations of Marx himself. One of the speakers talked about the Eurocentric framework in which Marx both emerged and reproduced in many respects. Being fair to the old man, I think, like all of us, he's a product of his environment, which I think he also eloquently analyzed and tried to break out of in a number of different ways. But I want us to have a conversation more explicitly about the development of the practice as we understand it from the Second International on. And there, I think, much of the bad shit really got codified, both in terms of practice and in terms of programmatic outlook, and how certain assessments got made, particularly about who and what the proletariat is and or was, and therefore what our strategy should be overall towards relating to each other and towards the project of the transformation of society. So if you have somebody spoke about it yesterday, if you have a view which only says that a small fraction of humanity and able-bodied men are going to be the transformative agent of all of society, which a lot of the theory of the Second International basically amounted to, you were bound to fail from the beginning. Because you had no practice, you had no program that could speak to the other forms of labor and how they were exploited and necessary. So domestic labor, quote unquote, no theory on how to deal with that or how to relate to that fundamentally. The issue with at that time, how to relate to all the colonized subjects of the world, you had no fundamental way of dealing with that. And in fact, it didn't necessarily, for most, to a certain extent, the Second International didn't even really factor into the equation. But all the practices, despite some of the theory, how we understood what the party is and isn't, most of that got framed during the Second International. How we understand both strategy and tactics, how we understand how to relate to the state, how to relate to bourgeois institutions, most of that got codified with either a left, right, or center kind of orientation from the Second International. And I'm bringing that up because one of the critical pieces is, what's the old phrase when Marx says, I am not a Marxist, right? So there was a certain type of codification which really reduced everything down in ways that we are still trying to get out of, which is why I think we're having this conversation today. Because the way in which it was interpreted was very narrow and did not attempt to deal with a lot of the fundamental questions on how do you actually deal with reality, as opposed to how do you move. Some of the things with the Second International was very much focused on, again, a narrow political subject, which is quite different than how do you actually transform the world. And then what do you need and who do you need to both understand the world and transform the world? So I'm bringing this up to a certain extent because I see there's a lot of conversation, which may not explicitly be rooted in this, but there's a lot of conversation throughout the broad left, such as it is in the United States, which is really going back in many respects and saying we need to look at the diversity and the broadness and the open character of the party of the Second International, and that's what we should be emulating in our point in time because allegedly it points to a more democratic orientation than the Third International and everything afterwards. I would say that that's absolute garbage and bullshit. And I want us to debate that. Now that doesn't mean I'm being a champion of the Third International, don't get me wrong. What I'm arguing for is we need to think within the context of the reality that exists for us and do a concrete analysis of that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't study history. I'm one of the biggest history buffs that there is. But I'm also consciously aware I don't live in 1848. I don't live in 1917. I live in 2018. And I have to understand that 2018 is actually profoundly different than even 1991. Because history isn't static, and the things that we have done and the things that have been done to us both interrelate, and they change dynamics, they change politics. And I think when we look at some of the kind of emerging movements, which I think some of this panel in particular is trying to address, like to make it real and concrete. Where is class in the analysis of Black Lives Matter, right? Where is class in some of the Idle No More or some of the indigenous movements which are cropping up around the framework of a just transition or indigenous sovereignty, right? Or I was just about to get there, to the women's march, or some of the new youth stuff that's emerged within the last couple of weeks about weapons, right? There's all these new social movements which are emerged, which are at least on the surface and how they're written and approached, very single issue oriented. I think that's actually an incorrect view of how to look and relate to all of them, to all of those different movements. And I think that the deeper piece is, if we're just looking at that model, going back to the Second International, particularly in the parties, if you're looking at that as a way in which to frame and build power, you're still going to wind up looking at everything else as an addition to, right? And not something that has a ground and a basis of resistance and transformation on its own grounds, which relates you and orders you different towards the practice of solidarity. So it's not just a practice of, I think how some people frame it, which I personally don't like, of the meaning of it in its base terms of showing up, I think is important. But if for politics is just merely expediency of I need your support, so I'm gonna show up to your stuff, you know, in the hopes that you show up for mine, doesn't actually deal with the totality and the recognition that, no, actually we need each other beyond expediency. We need each other in all of who we are and what we bring to the table to transform the world. It's a different orientation. So I would just argue that to a certain extent, going back to at least my own personal approach, I don't look at the Me Too movement or the Black movement for Black Lives or, you know, these things as being separate from my own ground and practice. They may be separate from my own limitation of being able to engage in time and space. But I think the critical thing is these are all correctives to some bad practices of our own. And if we don't embrace them in that regard, then we won't move forward. So that's what I would leave, you know, as a sharing and for us to open up discussion with.
Thank you, both of you. So I'm going to share some thoughts as well before we kind of start talking among the three of us, and then we say quickly we'll hopefully be able to open up for discussion as well. I'm happy that we have kind of two notes from real practitioners in the field. Mine are going to be a little more kind of scholastic, given the nature of my own work, but hopefully you'll bear with me. You know, I want to take this moment to particularly think about the kind of question in Marx and colonialism, or kind of Marx and post-colonial movements, particularly post-colonial movements that really emerged with nationalism as their kind of driving force. And, you know, as a critique of a type of Marxism that imagined that, you know, class could be would be the operative category here for emancipation and liberation, and how that did not really correspond with the kind of specific violence of colonial rule. And I want to talk about this through the lens of the Palestinian critic, academic, the late Edward Said, who is no doubt probably familiar to many people. And I want to talk a little bit about a transformation that I see in Said's work from his kind of early days to the late days, and why I don't think that this is just some sort of like inside baseball notes about a literary critic, but actually something that might be very informative for all of us trying to think through these questions today. And I want to start, though, with a little anecdote from an interview that the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish did in 1996. Darwish was one of Said's kind of constant interlocutors and friends. And in this interview, Mahmoud Darwish says, and I'm quoting here, "What is a homeland? It's a place that gives people the opportunity to grow, but not to make a flag from. In Ceasefire with the Mongols, I say that I'm going to make socks from the flag. I'm not going to dedicate my life to a flag." Jean Genet said that a homeland is a stupid idea, except for those who still don't have one. Goethe-Institut, the Spanish poet, answered him, "And when they have a homeland?" Genet said, "Let them throw it out the window." Okay, so I want to just start with this and kind of question about this, you know, take seriously this kind of notion of this being a stupid idea except for those who don't have it. And what do you do once you get it? Well, then you throw it out the window. And as I kind of dive into kind of this kind of work of Said. So Said is rightly known almost in this country as the father of post-colonial studies, publishes Orientalism in 1978, and it launches a mass effort to reevaluate the nature of studying the Middle East, of Arabs, of Islam. And Saidian frameworks have worked their way into a lot of fields, from medical anthropology to critical race studies. They stress the centrality of cultural othering in creating these discourses of dominance and subordination, and have been part of a widespread pivot in the humanities away from Marxian or materialist frameworks of analysis toward those provided by French theory, and specifically in kind of a post-structuralist turn toward the work of folks like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. And so Said himself kind of knows that he is associated with this turn, and really with popularizing this whole body of French theory, which often presents itself as a critical corrective to Marxist analysis. But there is a kind of a darker side, I would like to argue, to this scholarly turn. And in the kind of politics of post-structuralism, we get in its kind of most rigid or vulgar forms a kind of a denial of objective knowledge, the notion that all knowledge is constructed and socially mediated might be true, but the icebergs are actually melting. To give a kind of an example, that's not just like a linguistic event. And perhaps most importantly, post-structuralist analysis rejects Marxist approaches in favor of those like race and gender. And it's true that they are certainly not given their due in traditional Marxist analysis. And there are some very important correctives that have to happen. I think of someone like Cedric Robinson, for example, to underscore how the universalism of Marxism was based off of a pretty particular set of historical actors, and that some sort of adjustment in our thinking might be required here. But does that mean that all universalisms are then kind of off the table? Can we only hope to kind of make progress either theoretically or politically on these on the particular, on the individual group, on the Women's March, on the Black Lives Matter? Is there no kind of universal project that we should aspire to? Because are these universalisms just bound to become complicit in a kind of neo-colonial attempts to kind of dominate? And so I think that this divide between Marxian frames and post-structural ones is really quite meaningful for current debates about identity politics, epistemic violence, regimes of knowledge, all of this good stuff. And it points to this very thorny issue of particularistic versus universalist frames for action. So for all of this association with Said, with French theory, and with popularizing post-structuralism in the US, I think it's very fascinating to see that in the 90s, in the last decade of his life, he starts to express a lot of doubts. Not necessarily about whether these are useful analytic terms for doing scholarship, but whether these frameworks lead anywhere politically. And I'm going to just share two very short examples for you, kind of tracing this in the thoughts. So just hold with me for a second while I get this open. The first is from Culture and Imperialism, which is a work that he published in 1994. And he's kind of talking about the ascent of French theory, and says, right, in both Lyotard and Foucault, we find precisely the same trope employed to explain the disappointment in the politics of liberation. Narrative, which posits an enabling beginning point and a vindicating goal, is no longer adequate for plotting the trajectory of human society. There is nothing to look forward to. We are stuck within our circle. And Said will kind of go on to critique how limiting this type of a framework might be. Similarly, Humanism and Democratic Criticism, which is a work that's written in 2003, right before his death, I think that the critique gets even stronger. And I'm going to read here for you a little bit at length. He says, although I was one of the first critics to engage with and discuss French theory in the American university, James Clifford correctly saw that I somehow remain unaffected by that theory's ideological anti-humanism. Mainly, I think, because I did not see, and still do not see, in humanism only the kinds of totalizing and essentializing trends that Clifford identified. Nor have I been convinced of the arguments put forward in the wake of structuralist anti-humanism by postmodernism, or its dismissive attitudes to what Jean-Francois Lyotard famously called the grand narratives of enlightenment and emancipation. On the contrary, as a fair degree of my own political and social activism has assured me, people all over the world can be and still are moved by ideals of justice and equality. The South African victory in the liberation struggle is a perfect case in point, and the affiliated notion that humanistic ideals of liberty and learning still supply most disadvantaged people with the energy to resist unjust war, military occupation, for instance, and to try to overturn despotism and tyranny, both strike me as ideas that are alive and well. I'm not going to go too much further here because I don't want to kind of belabor the point, but I just want to note, kind of to return to this kind of question of nationalism that I began with, which is almost a paradigmatic instance, right, of a kind of a particularistic move and a particularistic notion of liberation. I think that it's also very fascinating to see that Said in himself, right, he's known as an activist for Palestinian nationalism. That is, in the United States, if you haven't read his literary criticism, that's probably how you've encountered Said. And that even this, and you read his stuff from the 70s, and it's like the romanticism of like the wonders of the PLO is like, it's extraordinary to behold. And you see this shift in his thinking, though, as well, to the extent that he gives he becomes kind of firmly binational in his political orientation toward the kind of conflict in Israel and Palestine in terms of what he looks for in terms of a future there. And I want to just close with some lines from him that he gave in an interview to Haaretz, which is the kind of New York Times of Israel, in 2000, and to kind of further, hopefully, drive this point home. And I'm quoting here as well. Theodor Adorno says that in the 20th century, the idea of home has become superseded. I suppose part of my critique of Zionism is that it attaches too much importance to home, saying we need a home and we'll do anything to get a home, even if it means making others homeless. And this pivots back to his interviewer. Why do you think I'm so interested in the binational state? Because I want a rich fabric of some sort, which no one can fully comprehend and no one can fully own. I never understood the idea of this is my place and you are out. I do not appreciate going back to the origin, to the pure. I believe the major political and intellectual disasters were caused by reductive movements that try to simplify and purify. I don't believe in that at all. I wouldn't want it for myself. Even if I were a Jew, I'd fight against it, and it won't last. Take it from me, Ari. He was speaking with Ari Shavit. Take my word for it. I'm older than you. It won't even be remembered. And then Ari Shavit says, you sound very Jewish. And then Said responds with, of course, I'm the last Jewish intellectual. You don't know anyone else. All your other Jewish intellectuals are now suburban squires, from Amos Oz to all these people here in America. So I'm the last one, the only true follower of Adorno. Let me put it this way, I'm a Jewish Palestinian, and that's where it ends. So with that, I'm going to open this up for kind of conversation between the three of us, and then kind of turn out to the audience as well.
Sure, yeah, I can opine with the best of them. So, Said, that was, so it was nice to hear that later quote in his life. Yes, people hold on to stories. Yeah. That's how we get through life, right? That's how institutions, parties, families, these are essentially stories and experiences we weave together. And I'm trying to remember who it was. Probably my friend Anne. She's a Catholic feminist theologian, and I remember her, we were bickering about something, and she said something to the effect that religion, like politics, is something that we experience together. It's something that we create together. And without that collective work, religious faith doesn't mean very much, and neither do political beliefs. And I spent A lot of my 20s reading a lot of really thick books. I was in an economics program in India where my Marxist professors thought that the way to teach economics was to make you start with Adam Smith and read everything in the original for like a year or two before you were allowed to like actually engage with Marx. And so my primary exposure to Rosa Luxemburg and even to Lenin, like the first really, really serious engagement I had with Lenin was Imperialism. And I'm like, oh, right, he wrote that other stuff too. I should read that. But similarly, my exposure to Luxemburg was as an economist. And I think, so I spent a lot of time doing that. And one of the things I've really enjoyed of my time since then, and I would suggest that this would be helpful to people who get wrapped up in sort of meaning and theory. You know, when the rubber hits the road is when we figure out whether our theories of life and of political work or political theory actually is useful. And the back and forth between theory and practice is in fact where the Marxism happens, in my personal view. It's where we actually understand, you know, precisely what Kali was talking about, the challenges of the Second International, for instance, which DSA finally left the Second International, the one that currently exists. So that's how we figure out these formulations are actually useful, is when we go out into the world and try and do things and we're like, oh, right, if your entire theory of change and of political, the lever of political action is a bunch of white guys in hard hats, you're not going to do very well. And so I really encourage people who are trying to unpick these kinds of things, whether it's post-structuralism, post-colonialism, all the posts, and trying to figure out their own way through the world, is to really engage in a collective project. That is really the most, it really is a very illuminating way of making your way through these kinds of conversations.
To go, but let maybe do a transition a little bit. So, how many people in here have read Black Reconstruction in America by W. Du Bois? Raise your hands up high, y'all. That was a timid raise. Okay. 3 people. 4 people. 4 people. Okay. I don't think you can understand this country without having read that book. I'm going to say that definitively. And some of the fundamental contradictions that we've been circling around for 200 plus years, I think are addressed there in a way that hasn't been addressed by anyone in the U.S. before or since. So Black Reconstruction by W. Du Bois. It's a book he wrote in the midst of the Great Depression, trying to well, it's a number of things. So one, it's a book about him, if you want to like personalize it. He's grappling with his own limited notions of socialism. He's starting to grapple actually with Marx on Marx's own terms in the way he hadn't before. He's looking at the question of what this Great Depression in its early stage is doing to the Black community, dispossessing primarily Black landowners. So for one thing, is for instance, when there was all this talk about Black kind of concentrated wealth and how much was lost in 2006 through 2008 through the form of home ownership, right? Many of you remember some of those discussions? that was minuscule compared to what was lost actually between 1929 and 1933. The largest concentration of black land ownership was actually in the 1920s. But that's not the general narrative that most folks are given or even understand about black people or how capitalism was actually developing inside the United States and what the Great Turn was from the Great Depression on, and what the new system basically was set up and constructed to do. And within that, you know, he's making some critical, raising some critical questions of how do you actually get black workers and white workers to address the central question of unity within the framework of a settler colonial empire. So he brought that in a way that really hadn't been treated, you know, I think with due seriousness in a lot of the left in the U.S. before or since. Very rarely. But there's a, you know, because there's this notion to a certain extent. Sorry. Please keep talking. Susie, can I go? There's a particular way in which we talk about this empire as a democratic entity, when in fact it's only been a limited democratic experiment for a small few. And it was never intended to be a democratic project for everyone.
And if I could just interject, one of the most interesting, so I work at Columbia University with a lot of very nice liberal people, and one of the things that I've been able to turn people towards a more complex understanding of what's going on, because it's very, very obvious now that Trump has been elected, but that what happens with Trump is that white people, nice middle-class white people, are suddenly in danger of being treated like black and brown people have been treated this whole goddamn time. And that voter suppression, for instance, is in fact affecting white people now. That structures around home ownership, home loans, business loans, car loans, student debt, that these are things that are the differentials around how that works for different kinds of people are starting to become more widespread. So yeah, I absolutely agree that there is something very much baked in. And when we talk about settler colonialism, we're also talking about a specific mode of gender relations throughout. And if people have ever read Ursula Le Guin, she has a series of 4 stories called Four Paths to Forgiveness, and it's about a slave society. I highly recommend those novellas. It goes into, in a way that I don't know I've ever seen a theorist ever do, but as a fiction writer, she's able to explore the interrelationship between gender norms, gender in the entire society of a slave society, and in a settler colonial society in a way that is just very, very vivid.
So, I mean, one of the things I wanted to kind of talk to you both about is, right, this, you know, this narrative. We mention it in the description for this for the panel, and it is really pervasive. That certainly looking toward 2020, but even toward midterms, that progressive candidates either have to go after some white working class vote. This is all in scare quotes, or go after, or kind of pay attention to things like Black Lives Matter, the women's movement, and things. And so there's this notion that this, you know, that we're kind of, our activism is kind of cleaving apart, and that we have to make this choice. I want to get both of your thoughts as to where that narrative comes from, why it is so pervasive, and particularly because I've seen some like really fascinating empirical data coming out of Minnesota recently that shows that it's actually false. You know, the group called Our Minnesota Future actually did this wonderful kind of test of 800 different voters, both white voters and people of color, about and looking at kind of how they respond to different narratives, and in fact kind of narratives that kind of tie race and class together, and make a case for how race functions within a broader system of economic exploitation were the ones that were most attractive to people, much more so than kind of either a just class-based one or something else. So, you know, given that we do have some data that this framing is not actually, that doesn't really hold much water, why do you think this is still the dominant way of talking about these issues?
because the mainstream media is really stupid. I mean, that's right, or it's an easy story to tell, or the Democratic Party finds that a useful narrative to explain why they do stupid shit. I mean, like, the Democrats love to lose. We could talk about that for we could talk about that for hours, and we could certainly go back and relitigate, Bernie Sanders' campaign and both the stupid things that he did, as well as some really interesting things. Michigan is a great case, right? Where a lot of the way in which he operated, part of the reason why he won that, aside from a really solid ground game that he somehow didn't create in New York State, was in fact that, like, he's a Jew and, like, Arabs really like him because he's super honest about, hey, Israel really sucks, like, what's happening is not helpful, that, extending the police state into the Muslim communities is terrible. Really obvious things. And I think the thing that people have to, I would say the most important thing to keep in mind whenever you read or hear these narratives is that close to half of the people in America don't vote.
Right.
So when you're talking about how voters behave, you're talking about a subset, and in non-presidential years, you're talking about an even smaller subset of people. Donald Trump got, 29% or 26% of the potential electorate, because barely half the country actually voted. And we have, in many parts of this country, an absolute regime of voter suppression. But people are also like, why would I vote? Right? And that has been something that, like, the limiting of our democratic practice in this country has gone back, 20 years, and, Google the Mercers and the Koch brothers, and you can read all about, like, how that policy got put together, who were the think tank people who spread it, the model legislation that has been shared from state to state. It operates precisely as the abortion fight does, as the gay bathroom thing does, or the trans bathroom thing does. There are think tanks that create model legislation and send them out all over the country. That's why you see the same thing over and over again.
Kelly.
I mean, yeah, to me, I think we need to flip some of this on its head, and I think you touched upon it. So, on average, for most of the last 60 years, roughly 45 to 50% of the people in this country who could vote don't vote. And I don't think we want to do a serious interrogation as to why. And I think we need to do a serious interrogation as to why.
Can I push you on that? Because this is something I've been thinking about and writing about, actually, is like the phenomenon of kind of, voter suppression is one thing, but there's also almost like a sense of like self-disenfranchisement that I see happening in many kind of countries amid a kind of shift to neoliberal forms of economics. I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to share about that.
I don't think it's just a shift, because some of this started before there was the formal shift to neoliberal economics in the United States. And I think the fundamental piece is there's nothing for a lot of people on at least within the framework that I've worked in. I'm gonna put it that way. I remember in my neighborhood growing up, initially in Los Angeles, an old neighborhood, old brother who this was in the 90s, early 90s. Who obviously had a certain level of politics, but just kept it real and was like, look, I'm not going down there to vote for any damn thing because capitalism is not on the ballot. I don't get to vote that away. And if I don't get to vote that away, you coming in or somebody else coming in, you're fundamentally going to just determine how to try to manage the contradictions of the system, which ultimately can't be managed by the own rules and logic of the system. So you're just there to be a stopgap measure. So it's like whoever's there is going to do some variant of the same thing, right? And then try to justify why their variant of doing the same thing makes sense for some form of immediate gratification or relief. So I think rather than flipping on its head, I don't think that whole 50% of people who don't vote, I don't think that's apathy, right? I think there's a deep criticism that's there about this is not the way in which the society is going to be transformed. But there is no organized expression or there is no organized force which then says, well, what is the program? How do we move beyond this? So there's nothing that speaks to, that transformative politics. And I see, like in our experience in Jackson, where we've done the most, I think, to actually mobilize working class forces is when we actually articulate a politics that goes beyond electoral victories and strategies. But the thing that gets the most kind of press and the most attention from most of the left are the electoral victories. So there's a gap there, right? That who are we actually speaking to? What are their interests? What can they move? What do they do? And even in the Jackson case, and so in our experience, I think if we really break that down, then move on. So to really break that down, in Jackson, there's roughly about 120,000 people who can vote, right? But the electoral contests in Jackson are typically determined by 45,000 people. So fundamentally, it's a popularity contest amongst that 45,000 people as to whether you could or you would win elections. And so you can either orient your program towards moving and convincing that 45,000, or you could say, wait a minute, there's roughly 75 to 80,000 people who are not touched, who are not engaged, and nobody's speaking directly to, that if you could win even a significant sector of that, it actually could double the existing force. But the problem is most of those folks are not necessarily willing to engage in the reinforcing the structure, right? Because they're like, that structure is going to maintain what exists one way or another, and how do we get beyond that? Where's the conversation about that? How do we move that? That is what I think is somewhat missing in the terms of looking at a 2018 or 2020. Because I'll end with this. So let's say, with all the mobilization and things that are being drawn up, that the Democrats take back the House and the Senate in 2018. What's their program? Ask yourself that concretely. What is their program? Are they going to jettison neoliberalism in any fundamental way? Right? So
it's too early for jokes.
No, I'm serious. Are they going to jettison in any fundamental way? So the difference is, I think what we're afraid of to a certain extent, I think, about getting real, is that Trump is willing to bring the terror that the United States practices on the rest of the world home. But that terror has been exercised and existed by all of these bastards from day one, right? Right, so
like that.
Until we come to grips with that, right, you can delay that inward cannibalism for a little bit longer, but the actual dictates of capitalism determine that there has to be a major restructuring of the world. That's coming here regardless of who sits in that White House or who sits in Congress, and what is our program to deal with it. That is the conversation we need to be having.
So, Kali, I want to jump in here with a question for you about kind of the in the immediate term, right? Ravi, you mentioned before, right? We don't have any sort of pure politics. So this is not the way that political action really actually works. So, on a practical note, you're choosing between two bad options, but one of them might be slightly less bad. What do you do? Are you in favor of kind of just sitting out the election until there is some sort of candidate on the ballot that you think is reflective of this kind of broader social, economic, political transformation that is needed? Or do you say, well, okay, these are, we have two highly flawed and imperfect candidates, but one of them is ever so slightly less so than the other, and that's worth standing behind. What do you practically do when you're faced with the kind of reality that we are faced with?
I mean, for me, there's a thing that we've been trying to articulate within Cooperation Jackson. The general framework, general eye, is build and fight, and they have to be done in equal measure. And if we're not trying to build up the practical institutions in our local ground up, communities around things that actually transform the immediate, the transform our local economies on a neighborhood basis, to build people's actual capacity to move, to have agency, to govern themselves, electing the lesser of two evils is not going to ultimately change anything, because I don't actually gain any strength, I don't actually gain any power. Now, does that mean you sit out, electoral politics? Absolutely not. I think if you see a good fight, you get in it, right? But I think the question is, what are we demanding? And what do we have the power to demand of anybody who's going to engage in that arena? And if we let the electoral candidates and the parties as they currently exist determine the agenda, you're going to get the minimum. The question is, how do our build activities both, build a framework, build power that then reorients what whoever's running in office, stands for. And I think the thing that we have to sometimes accept is that winning office does not necessarily mean you're building power. Building power means you're moving people to actually exercise agency, which may not always win you elected office. But if you can engage in electoral politics, for instance, I think what we've tried to do in Jackson is engage in electoral politics to actually build strength. Then you can have an orientation that whether I win or lose a particular campaign is minimal to the power that I'm actually accruing on the ground.
Yeah, Ravi, I want to let you hop in here as well.
Yeah, well, I think so there's, I think to probably restate some of what Kali is saying in slightly different terms, which hopefully will be helpful for some of the people in the room. The idea that candidates do things is, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of democracy, right? I mean, that's one of those lies of liberal democracy. Like, that's just not how anything works in any government ever. You've got, in capitalism, you've got organized power, you've got organized people, and whoever can do better gets to decide what the program is for your government. Like, that's just, again, like the nature of power. I spent last summer reading a lot of Carl Schmitt. It was very much a wake-up call. Highly recommend reading him. I think there's something about the nakedness, and I think part of the reason it was so illuminating is he was a Nazi. And the nakedness with which he talks about the state, the absolute lack of illusions, the fact that he goes back not to liberal Enlightenment concepts, but completely different concepts of the state, is enormously illuminating. And to read somebody like that at the same time as you're seeing Donald Trump and everything behind him, right? The nakedness of what has been happening in the rest of the world, what has been happening in our own settler colonial state, the openness with which that assault is now coming on the rest of us who have had the protection of class and region and coastal elites and all that. Like, we're fucked. But it's a very illuminating practice, and I think for a lot of the academic left and the organizing activist left, power is very depressing to think about when you don't have any. And so one of the things that has been really, as an observer of a lot of what Cooperation Jackson has been doing, has been really great is that grappling with what power actually is and where does it exist. And so in DSA, one of the things that we talk about in our electoral work is that we are not interested in access to candidates. We are not at all interested, oh, we'll canvass for you and maybe you'll like us in 6 months and we'll get some. Like, that doesn't work. Like, stop pretending that that works in electoral work. It's accountability, it's actual power. And that comes from being able to mobilize people in that district to put continuous pressure on electeds. That's the way electoral work works. And reading about how the Tammany Hall machine was created and how it functioned here in New York, again, highly recommend. That was power. It was raw and ugly, and it was power. It was based on relationships, on neighborhoods, on what mattered to people, what were the narratives and stories that could move people to the polls, who would turn out to defend these deeply corrupt, horrible people. But, like, why does that work? So I think understanding those things, understanding the nature of power is really important, and you have to do it without illusions, which is extremely difficult. I highly recommend therapy and a stiff drink, because it really is very dislocating for one's own class identity to think about how little power we actually possess, and that for many in sort of middle-class America, our sense of control over our own lives has been deeply destabilized because all these illusions of liberal democracy are sort of falling apart right now, and it's very, very dislocating.
I'll put Plunkett of Tammany Hall on the reading list next to Black Reconstruction if you haven't ever gotten to it. I think at this point, though, I want to open it up to the audience. If people have questions for myself or for any of our panelists, any questions? I'm going to just kind of do this like walk around with a microphone thing. Oh, you want to do that? Even better. Yeah, why don't we gather a few of them and then we can kind of respond in turn. So if you want to go 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. So you mentioned choice being two bads, and between two bads being Democrats or Republicans, why should it be two bads? I mean, we are in a time where some countries have 100%, you have to vote. Voting is a mandate, like Australia. And there are countries which had a third option, none of the above, to choose when you're voting. Like in India, they experimented with that. So how about we have those two, mandate voting and have a third option, none of the above? So if it's none of the above, it's a majority, you start afresh.
Let's gather a few more. There's other hands up?
I have not yet, regrettably, read Black Reconstruction in America, but I am in the process of reading Chokehold by Paul Butler. And it is in that context that I would really love to hear more about how Kali relates to the Me Too movement, because one of the things that struck me in that book is that police abuses of Black men, especially in relation to stop and frisk, are highly gendered. And that it's not enough to think about it just as being interrupted on the street. It's a lot more than that. It's ritualized and to some degree eroticized violence. And so I see Me Too properly understood as an opening for bringing all the stuff that we want to bring together in terms of race, class, and gender.
Okay, yeah, I had a question. I mean, you brought up the number of people who does not vote. I think actually for local elections it's even higher. Like here in New York, I think de Blasio was elected with 24% about that of the vote the first time. I don't know the second. So there is more potential on the municipalist approach that you guys are pursuing. And I think I would like to know how do you see, well, how this municipalism approach could generate that counterpower to state federal level in the way of confederation of municipalist states, and also from the legislative point of view, which limitations do you right now confront? Because you have a limited power in what you can implement, and any approach that pretends to do a deep transformation will have to confront those limitations.
Thank you. My question relates to a few of the terms that came up in the last hour. The question of humanism, power, and complexity, and Said and binational state and so forth, and Schmidt as well. It seems to me that this kind of complexity in which you are not making distinctions between us and them, where you have the notion of a binational state, for example, where you kind of are obliterating that, refusing to draw the distinction that enemy, who is the enemy kind of thing, in some way that really goes counter to the kind of adaptations, perhaps, that we as human beings have, right? We from our hunter-gatherer days, we are either predator or we get eaten up or we eat, and we are constantly we have been historically constantly evolved to make these distinctions. And I'm wondering the kind of romanticism and idealism that one of you talked about when we think of Marxism, if this may not be part of it, that we think as Marxists that human nature is infinitely pliable and mutable, And whereas we might actually have severe cognitive limitations as to what we can or cannot do simply as a result of our evolutionary history, which makes us draw these lines in the sand, make us distinguish between friend and enemy, and engage in politics on that basis, whereas this kind of thinking in a complex way perhaps makes demands on our cognitive apparatus that we might not be able to meet.
Well, I think speak to kind of this round of comments real quickly. Do you want to go?
Number of questions. Let me see where to.
Question about Me Too, right? On
Yeah,
one hand,
so the mandates.
voter mandates, that kind of stuff.
Me Too, ritualized violence, municipalist power, and I'm gonna call this kind of making distinctions for shorthand. So let me start there and bring it back to Marx, and what I find to be most relevant is within the methodology, the ability to constantly shift and move between the universal and the particular is the way I would describe it. And the way in which I know politically, me and the folks I've worked with, we constantly make actual distinctions between friend and foe, and constantly make distinctions between permanent interests versus temporary interests, which means that our given a particular issue or given a particular time, enemies can become friends, friends can become enemies. And operating within that paradigm and within that context, to see that things are always shifting, always in motion, and we have to be both attuned to the shifts and the motion, and you know, to borrow from Gil Scott Heron, the piece is to rather than, what he said, rather than be subject to the change, they actually try to direct the change. And being able to make that distinction and analysis, you know, I think is where we have the greatest power to exercise where we're going to move to. Now, and I think this gets to the piece to around the Me Too. So it's one of those things using that same framework. A part of it is both exhilarating, and another part of it is terrifying. I'll start with the latter. I think there's a particular type of people without power exercising micro power in the kind of shaming and blaming type of general orientation, which I think is emerging in a lot of the culture. Which is, you know, it's easier for me to take you down than it is to actually fight the state, or it is to fight capital. And there's, in some iterations of it, there's very little room for kind of growth and redemption, and it's ultimately framed around certain types of moral power and moral indignation. And with that kind of lens, if we do it, then I can condemn each and every human being on the planet for something, right? Which, does that enable me to actually practice solidarity with you and engage in the struggle with you, as opposed to recognizing your imperfections and trying to come up with ways in which to address them, right? Because I'm as fucked up and as inhuman in some respects as anybody. And then the other piece I do think is empowering is where I agree with you. I think that there is a way in which some aspects of the framing, and I think some aspects of the moment, actually force us to look at the terror that is this country in a broader way. So a couple of years ago, myself and a comrade, Arlene Eisen, we did first it was the every 36 hours, then it was every 28 hours project. They tried to document, you know, the actual rate, this was in 2012, of how many black people were killed by the police. It was an imperfect study because primarily it was like 1.5 people. Arlene did most of the actual research and me was doing most of the framing. And the methodology basically was scouring the newspapers of cities that had more than, I think it was 300,000 people, and just looking at the reports of who was killed. So in many respects, what we came up with, I would argue, is a gross undercount, okay? A gross undercount because of the limited tools, resources that we had. But the thing that we wanted to do, and just haven't either made the time or had the resources to do, was let's take that type of analysis, that type of investigation, and let's apply it to how many Chicanos and Latinos get murdered by the police, how many indigenous people get murdered by the police or some force of agency of the state. And then let's count how many people die in prisons, how many people die in the immigrant detention camps, those that we know and we don't know about. And our guess was that if you add that all up, it would amount to thousands of people arbitrarily, extrajudicially killed by the United States government year after year after year. But it's a disappeared figure that actually distorts the true level of state violence that is being committed amongst folks. And this was during the Obama era, not even the Trump era, right? And the point that we were trying to really point out is that actual attack and the assault on people by both Capitol and the state in our present era has been grossly misunderstood, grossly ignored, even by forces on the left. And I think part of the argument we were trying to make then and now is that if you don't pay enough, if the left is not paying enough attention to the reality of this terror, you actually open the door for a force like Trump. That was an argument we actually made, some preliminary forces and pieces in that piece in 2012. And the municipal piece is complicated. It's very complicated. And we started off with the notion that this is where we could build power in a way to be transformative, but we're always mindful of the fact that we're not going to build socialism in one city, right? Like, it's just not going to happen in that way. And so in some form or fashion, our experiment, our efforts, we're going to have to link up, first and foremost with other municipalist projects, and then from there work to transform. In our notion, it was to work to transform the states before coming to a notion of how do you engage the federal. But that's just a shorthand that I think needs some adjustment, but we can talk about that later.
Kali, when you were talking, you reminded me of what the Algerian Jewish intellectual Albert Memmi called the pyramid of petty tyrants. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's such a helpful concept, I think, for thinking about how we get divided and kind of lose sight of of the guys on top. I wanted to just say real quickly on this kind of question of of voter turnout and of kind of people really staying home. One of the interesting things that came out of this experiment that they did in Minnesota was that, I'm just going to read for a little bit from the article here, to determine whether a class-only message leaves voters of color cold, respondents of color were offered a third option besides supporting either candidate, and that was sitting out the election. Which is, as we know, actually something that people do kind of en masse. And in fact, people of color were twice as likely to report they would stay home when shown the class-only message compared with that kind of put race and class together. So I just want to kind of share that, and kind of to this kind of question of humanism and kind of pivoting a little bit back to Said. I think there's something helpful here that Said talks about when he speaks of humanism that can also be quite useful for thinking about our Marxism or our Marxist practice, right? Kali mentioned before that Marx says, I'm not a Marxist, that, what we have here is a set of tools, a style of criticism, and an analytic approach for thinking about challenges which are necessarily new in every generation. And, also I think this kind of reflects what you were saying in terms of kind of a romanticism and a codification of certain practices. No such thing should be possible. Because at least in the way that I kind of understand the usefulness of this type of analysis is something that is kind of ever evolving, very much in the way that people might think about like a legal text as something that kind of are accretive, that build upon one another and are always dealing with new circumstances. I think that is so much more helpful than thinking of a kind of a codified set of practices.
just a quick aside, I think one, of course, is that most of continental Europe, their legal system is a codified set of rules. So it's not surprising that that's where certain kinds of people end up.
I guess because I work on like religious law, which is actually incredibly much more flexible than that.
Yeah. And just a couple of thoughts, and then to deal with the idea of other electoral systems. I think one of the tensions that I think political action really needs to, political identity, political action, all of these things we're talking around, has to ride out is we all need dreams. Like, just because I'm saying it's a utopian dream doesn't mean I think it's a bad thing, right? Like, why would you get up in the morning if you thought, if you don't have dreams or hopes for a better world? It's that we can't turn those into religions, right? We can't turn those into totems. And we must always be prepared to wake up from our dreams. We must always be prepared to wake up and say, okay, that dream's over, what do we do next? And in terms of the question about other electoral systems, there are, I think...
What do you think about mandatory voting?
Well, look, I mean, I will say about all these flights of fancy about the American electoral system and how we could make it better, there are a couple of underlying issues. One is that we don't have a single electoral system in this country. People may not be aware of this. We have 50 minimum. And we have in DSA, as in every other left grouping, what one might call third-party dead-enders, right? They are completely devoted to this idea of some radical transformation of the American legal system, and that's nice, but unless you have a 50-state strategy to actually get us there, it's not helpful. Right? We actually need somebody who cares enough about these kinds of crazy ideas to sit down and explain how to make it work in Nebraska and New York State, how to actually get these changes to the ballot and to electoral law to actually work. So I will say there are not a lot of things that I have zero interest in talking about, but I will say that without real strategic thinking and practical thinking, third parties are of zero interest to me right now. Ballot line, the ballot line question, for those who are into that sort of thing, is to me a tactical decision based on your local circumstances. I don't have any sort of caring or opinion about whether we should be running on Democratic lines, ballot lines or not, but I don't want to talk about third parties until you can tell me how to get there in every state in the union.
I'm going to just see, are there other kind of questions from audience members? Okay.
Hi, I have a question on what you just brought up about sort of third parties, and then bringing it back to the original question that was like, what is a party? Could you, and this is really like very theoretical, it's not very practical, but like, could you sort of think about sort of the idea of like the social media movement or just like the essential materiality of social media and like digitized engagement? Could you also think of that as its own sort of party, because it's both sort of, I don't know, turning over the structure of what like normal like journalism would be, or like the access to information? So does that fit into your ideas about party systems?
That is an awesome question. That is literally something I was thinking about this morning. So thank you so much. So this is like turning into a lot of reading lists. Basically, like, I want all the people I know to read all the books that I'm reading and then like tweet about it, and we can all talk about it together. So I am extremely online, and as they say, like I was joking earlier about like left Twitter in 1915 or 1914, like, can you imagine how that Zimmerwald whole situation would have gone down if they'd had Twitter? I like to think about that sometimes when I'm annoyed about left Twitter. So here's what I'll go back to your question, like, what is a party? And I feel like the thing that we've got going on right now, to my mind, a party is an institution. It's something that is not ephemeral. It is the mechanism by which we take aspirations and plans and conversations and ideas and gestures and experiments, and we make them durable. So when I think of social media, so Jody Dean has this book called Crowd and Party. It's a great read. Not every political theorist writes good prose, so I'll plug her for that. I really like the way she engages with social media and online spaces, as well as sort of crowdsourced in real life movements, to think of them as crowd, to think of them as like the pre-riot or the actual riot. And so it's really fun to watch her take this like very 19th century concepts and apply them to the internet. And her whole idea about the party, which I think is really very much where I'm at, is that the party is the institution that takes that impulse, that longing for justice, right? That takes all the quips and the memes and all that shit and turns it into something which is durable, something which actually acts in the world in a collective sense. So a party is both collective as well as intentional, and it's about power, again. So these are all things that I think distinguish it. Now, when I say party, I don't necessarily mean the Leninist party form. Pour one out for that. I don't necessarily mean an electoral formation, right? Like, I think a lot of what Cooperation Jackson is grappling with is party formation, is organizational form, when it's not necessarily directly engaged in electoral politics. So I think you're absolutely right. And where does the crowd, where does the generalized sort of feeling of the moment form? And how do we act as part of that? You can't move a crowd. You can't move a Twitter mob if you're not in it, which is like a fundamental discussion that like people have about when they moderate online spaces, right? If you're not actually in it, if you're not in the conversation, you can't move it. And if you're not in the crowd, you can't be like, hey, there's the Bastille over there. We should do something about that. So yeah, I think these are really, really key questions that you're asking. Those are some of my thoughts.
Kali, you want to hop in here too?
To me, I want to go on a little different angle, if I understood your question correctly. To me, I think it's when it comes to electoral politics in this country, I actually don't think it's helpful to think about it in terms of parties. Because I would argue that's not what we have in this country, right? You don't have in either side fundamentally, you really don't have like a core platform that people then have to ascribe to, and then there's members of the party apparatus which determine who the candidates are. Like that form of where that term comes from Europe, the United States does not have that. What I would argue for that we have here historically, or you have different social tendencies that then get mediated by various forces of capital as to who they're going to support to reinforce the system or to reform the system, right? And here I think it's always critical to note that, for the most part in the United States, you vote for people, right? You don't vote for platforms, and you don't vote for policy, truth be told, right? Some states you have ballot referendums and stuff like that, but fundamentally on a national level, you don't vote for policy, you vote for people. And then those people, quote unquote, your representatives, then determine the policy within the narrow confines of which they work. And I think a lot of our argumentation around party in this sense confuses the question, right? Like the electoral piece is like, how do you mediate the tendencies that might reflect your interests? And the ballot lines, to a certain extent, can go anywhere based upon the 50 piece.
They don't have fixed meaning.
Right.
By any means.
And I think we get lost in that, right? And so I don't think, to me, the fundamental question is third party, not third party. I'm one who thinks that you need to try to orient towards building a third force that gives you some more choices, right? But this notion of trying to build another electoral vehicle, quite honestly, to me, is for the birds on a deep level. Doesn't mean I don't engage in it, but it's kind of for the birds. Because I think there's another vehicle of a party, right, that engages in politics far beyond electoral politics that is absent, which is missing within the United States, that we have yet to fully been allowed to build or really attempted to build, at least on a broad mass level. And that doesn't mean the experiments of the 20s and 30s and the 60s and 70s were for naught or that they were useless, et cetera. I'm not saying that. It's not for lack of trying that we haven't got to this point, but I think there's a confusion between what are you trying to build and what are you trying to accomplish in the U.S. context, which makes that question kind of a record on skip, like we won't get past a certain point because we're not actually asking the right questions.
Other kind of, yeah, I see a question way back here. Hold on. I'm going to just get up and start walking.
There's a microphone.
Oh, you have.
Oh,
never
hi.
mind.
Sorry.
Could you,
Should've spoke up
after you have your question, we have a few more back there too.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, there seemed to be a little bit of talk about sort of like the lesser evilism. And I was wondering like if there's just a basic response to that that's sort of like, you know, asking about more liberationism, and that becomes like the key focus for how like we as like a broad left, you know, from like anarchists to socialists to communists and like hopefully some of those liberals who can kind of come along and transform their own selves, that becomes a real important part of sort of what we need to think about. And that some of that I think just can, you know, just when I'm like listening to kind of connects to like this notion of like body powers and the ways that like it can be really depressing to talk about like how much power we don't have, but then focusing on the power that we do have, like within our bodies, to sort of get free from the sort of constructural conditioning that this system has taught us, like all the way to like the words that we use to identify our own selves, particularly for folks who like myself, who have like, been taught growing up to like see myself as white and as masculine, you know, and as, you know, like compulsory sexual, and, you know, sort of like to sort of develop a kind of like bourgeois way of thinking, but still having to like fight out of that to get like a working class consciousness. And how that kind of like connects all the way to like thinking about the power system of intersectional state capitalism, and how it's really important, I think, to like form like an existential basis of truth and care, like as a superstructure inside our own selves that we then know how to like practice with each other, you know, every day. And I kind of think like the worker cooperative model, and I'm in Newark, you know, is a model that really can be like transformatively inclusive, you know, in a way where, you know, the markets that can kind of work to sort of like, you know, exclude, you know, black folks, you know, Latinx folks, queer, trans, you know, disabled folks, you know, worker cooperatives become a way of like including everybody, but also transforming the system and maybe abolishing markets at the same time if we really get good at it. So I was just wondering, like, if that all becomes part of like this notion of like more liberationism, if this thing can connect in a very practical way to an idea that Engels had shared, you know, about elections, that elections are, you know, a sort of moment that work as a vehicle to sort of like count the massiveness or the non-massiveness of our forces. And if there becomes like a real practical idea of like saying like, you know, forget all the candidates in 2020, but let's all just write in, you know, more liberationism and see how much that number can get to count the folks that are actually practicing liberation in their everyday work. And, you know, whether that becomes a number that's in the thousands that then mass media then has to say, oh, we have to actually include this now in our like post-election analysis. And then that puts liberation on like sort of like the national agenda for something that's really like seriously being, you know, done. I just wonder what folks think about that notion.
Okay, thank you. I think we have some other questions. If we can maybe just pass the mic. Yeah, please.
That's a hard question to follow. I wanted to bring the teacher strikes into this space and to talk some about like what those mean in the formation of, like I'm thinking a lot about what you're saying, Ravi, about party and places where people can test for new forms of participation. And so I don't have a particular question, but I didn't want us to talk this morning without talking about the teacher strikes, both what's inspiring and what, how they might speak more to these kinds of questions, Kali, that you mentioned about being stuck in that second international framework.
Thanks.
And I just want to piggyback on the excellent question about like the digital and social media movements and how that sort of affects the kind of work and thought that people are doing here. And I'm asking because the idea that capitalism began and the idea that it might end are like seriously esoteric fucking knowledge here, and people don't know about this stuff, and there's no class consciousness really? And is it possible, does the panel think that changing the messaging, or I guess even the branding, is a way to create that? And does social media, does the digital space have potential to change that?
Oh, thank you, guys. I wanted to ask about, on the conversation of party form and also some of the motion happening to rejuvenate socialist politics in the US, looking at the recent example of Syriza and viewing the goal as a unified left or a coalition of the radical left that comes together to contest. Here's an example that seemed that not only did the masses of people through plebiscite in Greece reject the austerity, the neoliberalism that hit them, the old Socialist Party, which was utterly corrupt, and the old Communist Party, which was politically demobilized as a constituency group, were then superseded by the rise of this new coalition. And then when the question was called, we got all Euro, no communism, right? And in fact, that coalition of both revolutionary Marxists and people who were Euro-oriented seems that in many ways, for the topic of the discussion, shattered around the question of identity. That is to say, is Greece going to be a European country subject to the rules of social democratic welfare within a European context when that's being demolished? Likewise, in Germany, since we're in the Goethe-Institut, here we have a society that nominally has full representation, a variety of different political parties, but one party they don't have is a communist party, and they don't have socialist parties which operate to achieve working class socialism, that are internationalist on basis, and that are in many ways a continuation of the long series of white nationalist social democratic practices. And it seems like those political lines, despite the fiasco of Greece, of the most promising experiment on a socialist reformation in a crisis zone where there was massive autonomous political organizing, including anarchists, medics, farmers, everything across the country. And when the question was called in the legal forms of Europe, the answer was, let the youth of Greece move to Germany and work for them. So how do we face that situation? Ravi mentioned this idea of, we have to have 50-state strategies for X, Y, and Z. The last time I would sort of put forward that those questions were called, it was quite the opposite. We had a civil war, and troops from New York went down to Georgia and took care of business. And so on that discussion of the Reconstruction and where that's happened, in our own national history, where the question of full enfranchisement of the population was brought to bear, even though the political leaders weren't asking for it, that required an ongoing 15, 20-year political civil war that required some degree of political clarity. So going forward, and then I just wanted to ask one question sort of about why we continue to discuss questions of identity and politics through oppressed nationalities or people, whereas that question of, again, what is white nationalism? And if we're going to have it, is it really so different if Modi rises up in India, if the Saudis are now dictating to us what is Islamophobic, right? If we're supposed to view Al-Qaeda operatives in Syria as freedom fighters, which the only people who still promote are people who call themselves on the left. So we start having this thing called a left of what?
Hey, hello. I had a question about, we're talking a lot about power within the context of electoral politics, and I think everyone has sort of described just how our electoral system is very messed up and corrupt between having two parties and gerrymandering and everything. And you had talked about building power through electoral politics, whether or not the candidate wins. And my question is, so, how do we maintain that power that we're using through electoral politics? And sort of, what's the end goal of that? If at the end of the day, it doesn't make sense to have a third party, and the rest of the system's so fractured that we don't yet have the power to change that. And then also sort of in this situation where you have some politicians that just won't be moved regardless of the power you have through campaigning. And And then then what difference does it make the power that you've used, whether or not your candidate wins, the power that you've built, if at the end of the day, the change that needs to be made is through a politician that's not making that change regardless of what you do?
We'll take kind of this round. Do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So there's this guy named Gramsci who has this idea called wars of position, right? And part of what he's talking about, and I think it's a concept that people have used in a variety of ways over the last, however many years, essentially like fighting on a cultural front. And I think one of the things that people forget is that Gramsci's still a Marxist. And so fundamentally, wars of position, wars of narrative, cultural sort of interventions. The thing that often gets forgotten is the material basis for those interventions, whether you have power or not. So for instance, I remember around Occupy, we had a puppet guild, and they made great puppets. They were awesome. And at one point, one of the puppeteers sort of turns to me and says, we really love making these puppets, but I don't know that they're really doing anything. And I'm like, yeah. Because, again, the spectacular, the thing about culture is when it actually works, it has to have some kind of a material basis. You have to own something, right? And a lot of the challenges, the things that people like about the internet is that it feels like it's a free space and nobody owns it. That's not true. And which is not to say don't engage with that, right? Because I think you're getting to something that's really important about the lived experience of capitalism for a lot of people is through, and a lot of the reason why people engage in the internet is that it's this possibility of connection. And it's this possibility of meeting other people, and we have been able to move lots of people through those kinds of things. But what we have not had is a place, a long-term structure to move them into. We have not had a party, whatever the hell that looks like, because I think Kali and I are saying very similar things from our own experiences about, we're not necessarily talking about an electoral party, we're not necessarily talking about the old Leninist form. So that would be the thing that I would encourage you to really dig into when you are thinking about these questions of branding, these questions of position and cultural stuff. Think about who owns what, medium, message, who are you speaking to, who are you not speaking to? Who is creating the content, who owns it, who controls narrative. Those are things that can actually be really exciting organizing projects with people who don't necessarily get to set narratives. So I would think about those kinds of questions in that frame. In terms of the teacher strike, I'm really glad you brought that up because I think it's still ongoing, a lot of what's happening in that world, and I think it loops back to the Me Too question earlier on. There is no question that a lot of the activism happening around the teacher strike is deeply gendered. It is about an immense sense of being fed the fuck up, right? And if you look at the bands playing whatever songs, these are some very middle class white ladies from all sorts of random places, right? This is there's a culture and a class, this is a group of people who are starting to feel their own power. And it's very exciting. There is the question again of institution. If anybody tells you that West Virginia was this great insurgent rank and file thing, that's not true. But again, we have this legal framework in which unions simply cannot strike in certain states. So how do you handle that when you run a union? Who owns that infrastructure? How are people allowed to move through it? So I absolutely think those questions are very interesting. I'm not somebody who thinks every strike means the revolution is around the corner, because that's just silly. Those people exist, mostly on the internet, I think. Or possibly selling a newspaper outside. So, but I do think this is an interesting moment to talk about, and I think the role for socialists in those spaces is to really say okay, yeah, but how'd you get here? Like, it's awesome. You're angry and you're pissed off and you got 35 people in your kids in your class and no textbooks. That's great. Why did you get here? How did you get here? What can you and we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Right? Like, what's the ongoing, not boring, but engaging and empowering experience that needs to happen out of these strikes to create durable power and durable places for people to work out those issues? And then I think I should turn it over to Kali, and then we can toss it back and forth.
Yeah, you have some thoughts?
Those are some great questions, folks. I don't know if, trying to touch on all of them is going to be difficult. So maybe soundbite it a little bit. Changing the messaging and the branding is insufficient. There has to be an organized force that even has the ability to move in a coordinated fashion, that messaging and branding. Does it mean that we shouldn't be invested in doing more effective propaganda, which is, in essence, using the old term, what it is? But it has to support something. It has to reinforce something. It has to help move something, and I think that's the piece which is still missing. And I think the challenge for us is we don't like to be small, but I don't think we want to deal with the reality that we are small, and then how do you move from there, which is a different question, right? Accepting, like, this is who I am, this is where I'm positioned, and this is where I have to move from. So I want us to come to grips with that. This notion of body power, I'm trying to figure out how to deal with that piece. So let me try to situate it within my own experience. And again, going back to, one of the main things that was central to, and still central to a certain extent within the revolutionary nationalist tradition, the Black liberation tradition, right, is self-defense and protecting yourself. And for many of us, from day one, from birth, there's different aspects of the actual practice of learning all the arts of self-defense that are imbued within that. And I would tell you, as someone who mastered a certain level of that and was brought up within that, knowing martial arts actually makes me more aware of how powerless I am, right? Not how powerful I might be in this body, but actually how limited it is, and to the extent that I might be able to fend a few things off, but, the state has far more bodies to throw at me than my ability to throw one or two off. And if I don't move other masses of people to confront this beast, me feeling power in this body is actually not that critical. It's not really going to move anything. Now, that doesn't mean that our ability to stand firm psychologically is not important, and that those practices don't help build a certain type of, psychological strength, which I think is important for the struggle and the maintenance of the struggle. But I think there's a limitation that we have to be aware of that brings us back to a concrete materialism politically. Then the other piece is trying to move through real quick. The teachers' strike. I'm with everything that's been said, but the thing that I want to see us explore more, not to the exclusion of everything or anything that's been said, but what is the actual, from a strategic point of view, what is going to be the actual economic impact of the reforms that they have just won, and how sustainable are they? I can tell you in Oklahoma, what I do know in Oklahoma, Arizona, West Virginia, those are paper compromises. None of those states have the actual ability to come through on any of those things financially. So what they've done, I think, hopefully, is to accelerate a crisis. Are they themselves prepared to deal with that? And are we prepared to deal with that? As a movement, I think, becomes a larger question, which leads to the question about Syriza in the back, to me. Then I'll stop. And that is, I raised it yesterday and I'll raise it again today. I think part of this question and this notion of political leadership in the here and now, which I think Syriza definitely lacked, is how do you prepare from having the bully pulpit, which comes with being at the helm of the state? How do you actually prepare your social base to engage with the real consequences of the decisions that you make, right? I think that has to be one of the fundamental principles of political leadership in the era of neoliberalism, is to say that if we make certain choices to actually try to improve things, let alone liberate ourselves, the whole edifice of international capital and the state is going to come down on us like a ton of bricks. And are we prepared to have a lower caloric intake for the next 10 years? That's a real question that we have to get ourselves prepared for. Meaning to strive to be free means they will try to starve your ass to death. Now, are we prepared to make that choice? See, that's the real question we keep evading, like, well, maybe I could tweak this and the powers that be will actually accept that, when, the whole thing of neoliberalism is, in my view, we're going back to the 16th century, whether y'all like it or not. And either you go along with the program or you get crushed. And we keep evading, I think, that real conversation as to what is it going to take to be free. And to me, I want to bring us back to something I haven't heard mentioned here, which was some of the lessons from the Haitian Revolution, where that question got posed as like, either we are going to be free or going to be slaves. There is no mediation between that. And are we prepared to make that choice? And is the political leadership willing to engage the masses of people and the movement itself in a serious conversation of what that might take?
I want to just follow up on that and kind of speak to the kind of, I guess, the second half of that question, that, about, issues also of national identity, and whether we're looking at India, whether we're looking at kind of, Trump voters in America, or, German kind of ultra-right parties. For a long time, historians and folks who work in IR, right, there's a certain accord around the, about a certain type of democratic politics as being interwoven with market capitalism. This is starting to fray quite severely at the edges. We have, in this room, two of my colleagues from the Brooklyn Institute, Raphael Shop and Ajay Singh Chaudhary, wrote an excellent paper looking actually at the economic foundations of the Nazi state. This was published a few years ago. And what this was incredibly illuminating was showing the extent to which this type of fascism was not an aberration within capital, but actually something that worked quite well with capitalism. And this type of heightened sense of national identity and who is inside and who is outside and who the spoils get distributed to and who gets kind of locked out of that is something which is wholly compatible with our kind of current regimes of capital. And so when we're thinking about kind of a heightened sense of national identity, a push away from international bodies, whether you're talking about the EU, they're talking about the UN, and this kind of reassertion of national sovereignty, I think that we need to kind of keep in mind what the materialist basis of that is, and how this is not kind of an aberration or a move away from kind of capitalist forms, but actually something that might help those forms sustain themselves and function even more smoothly in this new era. Any other final thoughts? Hold on.
So, if your people came to power, what role would the U.S. play on the global stage?
I'm sorry, I missed the first half of the question.
If you made it to power,
who are you directing the question to?
the panel, all of you, people.
You're now the Politburo.
Yeah, exactly. People that speak at panels on Marxist politics in the U.S. What role would the U.S. play on the global stage?
I mean, the world would be, oh, sorry. The world would be so radically different that, like, it's a little like saying, like people who are like, what are you gonna do? How are you gonna abolish the police? I mean, part of this is like the socialist horizon and working backwards from it. What is the world that we believe in, and how do we get there? So, you know, I could suggest some novels that I think do a beautiful job of trying to encapsulate what that might look like. I'm a huge fan of science fiction. And there's some amazing shit out there that helps to imagine what that might look like and to then inform our political action and political theory in the moment. But like, you know, who knows, man? Like, who knows? Would the U.S. even exist?
Right, I was going to say,
right? Like, would it
if I
even
came to
exist?
power, there would be no United States.
Like,
It-
Do you guys interact with institutions in other countries? Like, is the solidarity, the international solidarity of the working class happening in in your daily practice?
By my definition, no. Is there an aspiration to? Yes. You know, the most that you know, and I do a lot of international travel connections. I mean, but in practice for me, concretely, to me, it's like I'm going to see the world, you know, the laboratory of experiments that are taking place in the world. And from the tradition that I spring from, I see as my task is to dismantle this beast to give folks in the rest of the world the room that they need to transform their societies, right? To deal with the, you know, to deal with the beast on its own terms, in its heart. Yeah, I mean, but outside to a certain extent of offering in the here and now, right now, by how I measure power, I can offer you some rhetorical support, you know, to different causes, and some of them are very dear to me and have been, like, you know, the Palestine has always been dear to me, you know, particularly from the first Intifada, because it always, on a certain level, to me, demonstrated the extent, Palestine represents the extent to which imperialism will go. Because you got something that, you know, you could talk about struggles in Africa, struggles in Asia. None of them get the amount of attention that the struggle in Palestine gets, which is not to the fault of the Palestinian people. But you can commit a crime that grave in front of the rest of the world and be able to get away with it for this long. Like, there's a lot of lessons that have to be learned from there, and a lot of illusions that I think Palestine constantly says has to be shattered, but we still keep holding on to, like there's going to be some mediated, you know, settlement from the imperialist forces around how this is going to play itself out as the folks on the ground finally, you know, breaking through with international solidarity, making the distinction, right? Until we get to that point of having an organized force that can help, it's like we're offering rhetoric, and we have to continue to offer the rhetoric to at least create some space, but we shouldn't have any illusions that, to a certain extent, it's altering some things. Until we can actually, you know, make some material impact on how things move, it's going to be, it's limited. But I think this also goes back to one of the pieces that was raised in the back that I didn't touch on a second ago, and have to would like for us to deal with. Part of the thing I think with Syriza mirrors, I think, some illusions that we have deep within the United States. And the big piece to me that was always problematic was they built a politics, this may sound harsh, but they built a politics on a European Union that they wanted to be, not upon the European Union as it concretely exists. And that led to some very just tragic choices, like asking people to vote no when you really always intended to go with what the Troika was going to say anyway, because you weren't serious about leaving, right? And Germany knew that off the top. Like, okay, you can play that game, and then what did Merkel do? She hit them with even worse conditions afterwards. Like, you would have got a better deal the first time I offered to you rather than go through this motion and then, so now I have to teach you a lesson, right? You and the rest of the world a lesson. But that was a politics, I would argue, based upon what people wanted it to be, as opposed to what it is. And a lot of the aspirations of the left and bringing it back around how we envision kind of multiracial unity and multiracial politics and, what did Obama say, the imperfect union. Like, you're describing a politics in a country that you want, not the one that actually exists. Mm-hmm. And until we deal with the one that actually exists and can see it clearly, you're going to come up with, steal from Fred Hampton's, answers that don't answer, conclusions that don't conclude.
And on that, I think we actually have to conclude. And thank you to Ravi, thank you to Kali, thank you all of you for your questions and insights, and for joining us this morning. We are going to take a bit of a lunch break here and pick up again at 1:30 with a panel on capitalism, ecology, and technology. Once again, grab a schedule, grab a Marx map. They're great fun to let you guide you around Marx-related sites in New York. And thank you all for coming out.
Thank you.